Hello and welcome to the webinar on local energy economies organized by Mainstreaming Innovation Project here at Glasgow Caledonian University. My name is Branka Dimitrijevic and I will moderate today's webinar. I also direct this project, Mainstreaming Innovation, which is a joint project of 9 Scottish universities funded by Scottish Government. We support collaboration between businesses and academia in developing and testing innovations for low carbon infrastructure integration. If during this webinar there is a fire alarm or any online disruption, please try to reconnect later. But of course, we will also save the video recording of this webinar on our website, so you can watch anytime after a few days. We plan to finish presentations around 1:30, but you can start asking questions by using chat facility at any time during the webinar. Your questions will be answered after the presentation, and the event will close around 2 o'clock. Before we start today's webinar, just a few words about our project, Mainstreaming Innovation. Our project, as shown on this slide, supports integration of different types of infrastructures, including landscape and biodiversity, which we can look at as a resource, but also as an instrument for mitigation of climate change. The connections between different infrastructures, as shown on this slide, really indicate that we are looking for synergies between different infrastructures in order to achieve better efficiencies and to reduce costs. So the project supports collaboration between researchers and businesses in innovating for this type of integration of different types of low carbon infrastructures in the built environment. Currently, there are various funding programs, Scottish, British, and also European, for low carbon infrastructures. And we have organized a series of webinars and live events about these funding programs. This is the third one in this series, and it is about the project supported by Community Energy Scotland. Today's speakers are Felix Wight and Gutierrez. I would like to welcome them and also to thank for accepting the invitation to talk about Community Energy Scotland projects. And I would kindly ask you now to start with your presentations.
Thank you, Branka. And thank you to everyone who's dialed in today. We're delighted to be giving this presentation and to communicate some of the work that we've been doing, looking at the opportunities for local communities to have a greater role in the local energy supply and to own and operate their own renewable energy systems. So I'm going to be starting the slides today, and then I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Julia, a bit of back and forth between them as we go through the slides. Just to give you an overview of what we're going to be going through, I'm going to start off with a description and a bit of history of our organisation, Community Energy Scotland, where we've come from and what we're looking to do now. Also then go on to talk about how community energy has evolved from where it started in Scotland about 10 years ago to where we are now, and what we're looking to do next, some of the opportunities that are emerging, not just for communities, but also for new technology companies, for local authorities, network operators, and finance providers. And go into a bit more detail on the nature of the challenges that community energy projects are now facing in Scotland, and some of the potential technical solutions to those challenges. And then switch to some examples that Julia's going to go through of successful projects from elsewhere in Europe and around the world that have actually implemented these technologies, so that we know that they work. There is a proven technical solutions out there. It's a question of how we implement them in a Scottish context. And that leads on to us talking a bit more detail about the work that we're doing on that front in terms of the projects we're currently supporting and the ones on the horizon, looking ahead a bit, and the approach that we're taking to making the process a bit easier for communities and other stakeholders, because it's a very new field. There's a lot of different technology options. It's quite a complicated regulatory environment. There's different funding sources that need to be brought together, and there's a range of stakeholders that need to be talking to each other. So we'll be talking a bit about some of the things we're doing to try and make that process a bit easier, and share the learning that we've picked up over the last 12 months or so. On that side of things, we've got a conference coming up on the 5th and 6th of November. We'll be going into these issues in a lot more detail, which is really focused on exactly that, sharing learning. So we're going through the program for that. That's the end of the sort of the formal presentation. We'll have a bit of time for questions. Feel free to raise questions while we're presenting. Branka will be collating those, and then we'll feed them through. Hopefully be able to answer them at the end. So just to kick things off, a bit of background about ourselves. We were set up as Community Energy Scotland in 2007, but we'd had a presence in supporting community energy projects in Scotland going back to about 2003. We were originally part of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, a regional development agency, and then we split off to form a separate independent Scottish charity that is membership based. We've currently got about 400 members across community organisations, predominantly community organisations, but also associate members from businesses and individuals who are interested in community energy and want to support it. And our role really is to make the journey easier for communities that are interested in setting up their own renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, as a route to improved community resilience, increased local autonomy and local decision making, and all the sort of holistic outcomes that can come out of having greater control over the local energy supply, which include health, which include income for employment, include improved housing, include improved health outcomes. So it's very much seeing renewable energy as an enabler for those outcomes, rather than just something in itself which is about low carbon or about energy cost. It's a much bigger picture. And in the course of the presentation, we'll kind of bring out how we're trying to bring some of those outcomes together and place more of an emphasis on them than has been possible to date. The way we do that is essentially being pathfinders, being advocates, providing direct advice and support to communities in Scotland, and helping them access funding and navigate the options that are open to them. And we also play quite a big role in raising policy issues that affect the community energy sector, and trying to get those changes made that will make the process easier, to clear log jams, and overcome, I think it's fair to say, an environment, a policy environment which wasn't designed with community energy in mind. Some quite fundamental changes required to realise the full potential of the sector. At the moment, for any community getting involved in this area, it is a pretty hard journey, and a lot of it is against quite a strong headwind. So we're trying to make that process a bit easier so more people can participate and share the benefits that are possible when you have a successful project. The little map on the left-hand side just gives an indication of, sort of the number of projects that we've developed to date. Most of those are small-scale microgeneration projects where you have a renewable energy technology such as solar panels or a biomass boiler directly feeding the energy needs of a community building like a leisure centre or a village hall. But there's also a number of larger scale what we call income generating projects, which are something like a small wind farm or hydro project, where the emphasis is more on exporting electricity to the grid, selling it to a licensed electricity supplier, and using that income for community development in the ways I've mentioned, in terms of funding local community facilities and services that might previously have come from public support from local authority or central government, but as those services are scaled back or aren't matching the ambition of local communities, other sources of income are required. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that transition from microgeneration to larger scale income generating projects to what we're framing now as local energy economies, which is looking at how as much as possible of the energy that's being generated locally can also be used locally to maximize those additional benefits and synergies that Branko has already touched on. So this slide is sort of trying to communicate some of the multipliers that are possible when you combine local energy generation with local ownership. That local ownership element is what means that the benefits from the local generation are being captured locally and being maximized and are available to everyone within that local community, rather than just those people who, if it was privately owned, would be owning it, or if it was based on a purely share-based model, the people who have invested in it. We're always trying to make sure that everyone within the local community is able to benefit in some way as much as possible. Although there's a wide range of delivery models for that, from 100% community ownership, which is a lot of how the early projects have been developed, to joint ventures where ownership is shared with other organisations as well, and ways of raising finance that actually draw from investors further afield, but still is helping enable these projects with a high level of community ownership. And that's what drives the level of local income coming from the projects. Now, with the income generating projects, that's literally been income, it's been cash, because even if there is a wind turbine plonked in the middle of a village, the energy is being sold to another company, to a licensed supplier. So it doesn't touch the walls of people's houses effectively, even though the electrons might be flowing into people's houses. The contractual arrangements mean that people are not buying their electricity on the whole from that community-owned turbine. So it's just creating as things stand, it's just creating a cash flow. And what we're looking to do is actually turn that into a cash flow and an energy flow, so that the energy that is being generated is also being supplied to local people at an affordable price. Because generating income is great, but as energy costs rise year on year for electricity, for heating oil, transport costs, it's clearer than ever that there has to be some direct link as well between the energy generation and local use. So it's finding the technical, contractual arrangements that make that possible within the current regulatory framework. And where you can make that work, that probably doubles the economic benefits from having that community-owned energy project. So there's a really big prize there if we can find a way of making this work. And it's not just about using the energy locally in the sense of energy costs. It's also about how having that different sort of infrastructure. Let's say you're putting in a new heat network, which is one way of supplying energy to local users. Or let's say you're having to put in some storage equipment to match local needs with when generation is available. All these things are also creating new supply chain opportunities, which can also feed benefits into the local economy because of skills opportunities, installation opportunities, which is kind of increasing the size of the pot from having this project. So it's taking a more holistic view and trying to capture as many benefits as possible from having these projects. So that's the idea of local energy economies and how this concept has evolved from where we started with the microgeneration projects. But there's other drivers as well, and I think, to be honest, what has precipitated this is the fact that the model that we were working with in terms of being focused on income generation from exporting electricity to the grid has come up against some major challenges, and that's what I'm going to talk through in the following slides. What's already been achieved has been very successful, and already has a transformational impact. The average level of income from a community-owned turbine, as things stand, 1 megawatt wind turbine is about £100,000 a year, which compares to the sort of £2,000 to £3,000 you might be getting in a community benefit payment from a commercial wind farm. So several orders of magnitude bigger. If we can also capture the local value of the energy, then there's an even bigger reward there. But just to move on to the barriers, well, one of the main ones has been grid access. So in the early days of renewable energy development, you had a fairly empty grid, in the sense that the grid had been sized for supplying demand from centralized energy generation. There wasn't very much distributed generation, so generation that's at a more local level on the distribution network. As more distributed generation has come on, it's led to limits on the network being reached, basically in terms of the capacity of the infrastructure to take those power flows, which it wasn't really originally designed to do, either in terms of the volume of electricity flowing through the wires, or in terms of the size of the control systems for managing those power flows, or in terms of just having electricity flowing bidirectionally, rather than just coming downstream from generators in the central belt. So there's a whole range of technical issues to do with that, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, but suffice to say, there isn't space in lots of parts of Scotland for significant amounts of new generation. And the way the regulatory environment works at the moment is that if you're a generator wanting to connect to the network, it's your responsibility to pay for the costs of that connection, both in terms of literally connecting and in terms of wider upgrades, wider reinforcement that might be required as a result of that connection. And what that means in practice is high costs and also long delays. So you might have a viable project in terms of having identified a viable resource, a good burn for a hydro project or a windy site. You might have all the other planning consents in place, but if you don't have grid access, then you don't have a project, because there's nowhere for that power to go to. Other challenges, the incentives and subsidies for renewable energy generation, particularly for electricity rather than heat, have been changing quite rapidly, creating quite an uncertain environment for people looking to develop and invest in projects. The main incentive mechanism for smaller scale projects below 5 megawatts is the feed-in tariff, and it's fair to say that the feed-in tariff has dropped. The tariff levels have dropped quite significantly since it was launched in 2010, and is looking like it's going to drop a lot more. That's a problem for building projects, particularly in remote areas where the capital costs tend to be higher than average. There may be a better resource than average, but you've also got higher upfront capital cost. So you need to find ways of maximising the value of your generation so that it's not just dependent on the level of subsidy to be viable. Another challenge is, particularly for wind, is the local acceptability of projects. In some areas there is opposition to wind, and it's important to be able to offer, to be clear on the direct benefits that are coming to communities that develop these projects. And yes, having a cash flow that can be used for community development is important and attractive, but if you can also deliver lower energy costs for people, that's something that a lot of people are interested in. And the other kind of source of urgency in looking at a different model is the fact that energy costs, as I mentioned, continue to rise unsustainably, really, sort of 10-15% year on year, is outstripping most people's increases in salary and other living costs. So it's more important than ever that we are able to directly control the price of energy consumed by communities local to community-owned projects. So how, at a conceptual level, how can that be achieved? How can we unlock some of the barriers to getting these projects connected? Well, this slide sort of shows three routes, and I'm really thinking about electricity generation at the moment rather than heat. The first option is the traditional one, which is to reinforce. So to make the network stronger, bigger, more interconnected, put in controls that allow the bidirectional power flows, etc. And we're definitely going to need to do that because the scale of the resource in Scotland far exceeds the capabilities of the existing infrastructure, and also exceeds the local energy demand. So if we're looking to get that power from remote places to other parts of the country, reinforcement is required. However, it takes a long time and it is expensive. So from the perspective of the projects that we're working on, we're looking at what else can be done to bring forward connection timeframes and also to add value, because if you're just reinforcing, that's basically continuing the traditional model of generating electricity in one place and then sending it elsewhere. And what we want to see is how that electricity can actually feed into the local context. So I suppose the next level of solutions is around how the network itself can be changed to better manage and accommodate new generation. And that's around putting in more intelligence on the network so that power flows are visible, having more flexible connection arrangements so that a generator can operate when capacity is available but be turned off when it isn't. At the moment, that's not how distribution networks work. You get given a fixed amount of capacity which you can use or not use. In theory, if you're not using it, someone else could be, but that's only possible to deliver if you have the right controls and monitoring equipment in place. And those approaches are generally called network-based solutions and encompass active network management, dynamic line rating. Julia's going to talk a bit more about those further on. But the third tier of solutions is really where we see this link, this more direct link to local communities and their local economy, and that's about the demand side. So it's saying what are people's actual energy needs across heat, transport, electricity, waste, food production, IT systems, and what is the best way of meeting those needs from the renewable energy sources that are available in that local context. And by creating that fit between local demand and local generation, you don't actually need, potentially, to do as much reinforcement to the network as would otherwise be the case. And you're also creating a much higher level of local economic benefit. So how that, I'm going to kind of move on to sort of how that works in practice. But just to give you an idea of some of the kind of the key sectors for local energy demand. On this slide, there's a picture of some hydrogen gas silos. There's also a picture of a wind turbine and a little electric vehicle, and there's also a picture of some storage heaters. So these are some of the ways in which generation can be captured and transformed from electricity into other energy needs. The picture of the van is from a project in Fife called, well, it was called the Hydrogen Office, it's now called Bright Green Hydrogen, I think. And they've got an on-site wind turbine, about 800 kilowatts, that generates hydrogen through electrolysis. That hydrogen is then captured, and when they want electricity, when the wind turbine isn't turning, it's converted back to electricity through a fuel cell, and in this instance, part of that electricity is used to charge a little electric van. Similarly, the storage heaters are a reference to a project up in Shetland involving using heat demand in the form of electric storage heaters to manage output from the wind turbines that are operational and going to be built in Shetland, to allow a higher level of renewable generation than would otherwise be the case. We'll be talking through these technologies and some specific their applications for specific community projects that we've been involved in, but this is just to give an idea of the range of ways that you can link local generation to local demand, and what that means in practice is also adding value. So rather than being paid maybe 5 pence per unit, if you've got a wind turbine, you're selling the power to a licensed supplier, you can potentially getting, from the generator's point of view, a value that is 10 pence per unit, 15 pence per unit, depending on what local energy sector you're feeding into. So there's different prices for electricity, there's different prices for transport fuel, there's different prices for heat. What price you charge will depend on what the local alternatives are. So when you're analysing your constraint problem, you're also going to be looking at the value of different local energy demands, local energy markets, and finding the best economic fit as well as technical fit. And bringing these things all together, it's tying the local generation to local transport, to local heating, and the delivery agent for that is some sort of local energy or local electricity supply company. That's how you get that doubling of local economic benefit, by feeding into demand and then also controlling the supply that takes the power from the generation source to the end use. Now, that's not how it works at the moment. So to try and describe how this process could work, I'm going to talk about it conceptually, and then Julia's going to go on to talk about it, how it's actually working in practice in some projects elsewhere. We weren't sure in terms of the audience today how familiar you might be with how the electricity supply market and the regulation of the grid currently works. So we've tried to break it down into the basics, and the key variables really are how the power flows work, so how the electrons go from generation to demand, and then how the cash flows work in terms of who benefits from those power flows, because they are not the same thing, and it's important to be clear on that. So starting with the simplest scenario, which is where you've got an on-site generator. So this would be solar panels on a house or a small micro wind turbine in a garden. Here, the electricity that's being generated by that generator is flowing directly to the local user because it's connected on their side of the meter. Anything which they don't use gets exported to the grid. But on the whole, in general, their generation is going to fall short of their total energy requirements. So they're going to be importing power still from the grid. So that's why there's a blue arrow in the bottom right going from the pylons to the house, and there's a blue arrow on the bottom left going from that little turbine to the house. What that means in terms of cash flows is that the income that's being generated by the turbine is flowing to the owner of that asset, to the householder or to the community that owns it. But at the same time, because they're still buying power from the grid, their income is still going to the electricity supplier that supplies them. And again, it will vary depending on the size of the installation, but it's likely that a significant amount of their income is still going to that supplier. What the next slide shows is what happens in the case where you've got a larger scale income generating turbine. Now here, there is no direct electrical connection between that generator and local consumers. So there's no black line between the wind turbine and the houses. Let's see if I can just pick up an arrow to make things a bit easier. So yeah, there's no direct connection. The wind turbine is connected to the grid, so that's those pylons there, and likewise local consumers are also connected to the grid. But it's on the public side of the meters. It's not what we call behind the meter, where you control that connection. It's connected via public infrastructure, which is managed by the local distribution network operator. Again, we split it into cash flows and power flows. So here the power flows are showing the electricity going from the turbine to the grid, and electricity being imported from the grid to householders. But there is no direct sale of electricity from the turbine to these houses. What that means in terms of cash flows, the generator is selling electricity to the grid, that's generating an income. That income is then being used, passed on to the local community. That's great, £100,000 a year that wouldn't otherwise be there. But that community is still having to buy the electricity in from the grid, and that represents probably a net outflow of cash. It's probably something, if there's a community of 2,000 people, they're probably spending in the order of £300,000 to £400,000 on their electricity bills. So even if you've got 100 grand coming in from the turbine, there's still a net loss. So how might that change? This slide is an illustration of how a local energy economy might work in practice, just looking at the electricity side of things. Integration with heat, transport, local food production, that's sort of another level of integration, which we'll talk about a bit more later. This is focused on electricity. And what's changed in this slide is that rather than just thinking about a single generating asset, there's a portfolio. So we've got a wind turbine, we've got solar panels, we've got a biomass CHP station, which is making electricity from wood, as well as heat. And as well as that bigger mix of generation, you've also got a locally owned electricity supply company. It might not necessarily be just for that community. It might be a regional supply company, but it'll have some sort of community or non-profit distributing remit. And they are buying the electricity from those generators and then retailing that electricity to local consumers. And that means that while there still isn't a direct physical connection between those generating assets and local users, there is a commercial arrangement, which means that the power can be sold at a price determined by what is financially viable for that supply company. And they can pass on those savings to local consumers. That's reflected in this sort of cycle of cash flows up here, whereby the income that's coming from those community-owned generators is flowing to the local community as before, but also what they're paying in terms of their bills is actually being recycled through the local electricity supply company in the form of lower energy costs or feeding through into a community benefit fund in the same way as currently works for the generation. What that means is that the net outflows of income from that community are less than they would be otherwise, and more of that value is being retained within the local economy. What that means in terms of power flows is that more of the energy that's being generated by this locally owned portfolio is being used locally. But in order to make that possible, you also have to have demand management. That's the green arrow. And that's basically introducing the technologies that are required to create a better fit between when power is required and when it's available from that generation mix, which may mean energy storage. It may mean automated control of load so that things are turned on when generation is available. It's a whole range of things that need to be looked at, which aren't currently being delivered by traditional electricity supply companies. And the net effect in terms of power flows is that there's smaller net flows between this community and the grid. So the grid becomes more of a backup or a balancing mechanism rather than a supplier of energy of first resort. So that's it at a conceptual level. I think people looking at this for the first time could justifiably be a bit sceptical. It seems quite far away from where we're at now and the relationship most people have with their electric supply, which is always on, always there, essentially invisible, apart from when you're paying a bill, which tells you the cumulative amount that you've used, but not when you've used it. So we're now going to move on to some examples of how systems like this have actually been delivered. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Gutierrez, to talk that through in a bit more detail.
Okay, thank you, Felix. And hello, everyone. So if you, at this point, might be thinking that all what Felix was saying was like, sound really great, but then you might be wondering, okay, how is this really possible? And how do we know that it's really possible? So we know because it is already happening, and it is happening in many places around the world. And today we have, just to give you a flavor of the kind of examples that we have, that we know that are happening elsewhere in other places in the world. We've brought two key examples. These two stories are really inspirational in the sense that you will see how all the different elements that Felix was talking about are integrated into a whole system, and how the community becomes, how you have electricity generation transforming a community into an energy center. So let's get on with that. If we go to the next one. Okay, so the first example that we have here is Summerside, the city of Summerside. Summerside is the second largest city in the island of Prince Edward in Canada. And it is perhaps one of the best examples that we've come across that integrate wind generation with space heating and hot water. So I've brought a video for you to watch. You can also watch it on the website of the city of Summerside, but I wanted to show it here so that you have an idea of the kind of solutions that we are proposing. So just a bit, I will go just a brief introduction of how the project is, and then I will leave you to the video so for you to get an idea of how it works. The story of Summerside began in 2009 when they installed 4 massive wind turbines of 3 megawatts each. And at the same time, they engaged in a contract with the local wind developer to buy green electricity for the city. So the private wind developer has 9 megawatts of installed capacity. And they started these two things at the same time. And by 2011, they were already claiming that the city was running almost 40% of the time primarily in wind. So by that time, that was a success. But then when you hit that point, you see, okay, how much can I get from wind? And so by that time they realize, okay, we are wasting much of our resource when there is low electricity demand in the city and we have high winds, for example. And at the same time, they see the city, the heating system in the city primarily based on oil. So they just join these two parts of the puzzle and say, okay, we have an opportunity here and we will take advantage of this. And they partner with the local heating company and they launch this program called Heat for Less Now. So Heat for Less Now is part of a smart grid services scheme that the City of Summerside launched. And the idea basically is to divert wind generation into space heating and hot water for domestic use and industrial use at the same time. The program is arranged in such a way that the customers are invited to join the program and they get an electric heater that is remotely controlled by the SCADA system of the generator, and this is using optic fiber. And in this way, the generators are able, the utility basically is able to gain flexibility and controllability of the generation, and that has given them a lot of advantage on controlling the wind and making the most of the resources that they have. Having said that, I will leave you to the video for you to see how this is becoming a success in Canada, and for you to pick up more details regarding what is said in the video. So let's get on with this.
Summerside, Prince Edward Island. We're situated on the most narrow point of Prince Edward Island, a very windy area. We use the wind farm to protect the environment, to save money, and to assist our electrical utility here in the city of Summerside.
We got 50% integration of wind as used for electrical energy in the community, but that also left us with 15% excess wind energy. So one of those things we did and challenges we looked at was, how do we store electrical energy? We had a whole process of creating a retail space and programs. We were actually to show that participating residents and businesses could achieve up to a 42% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, they could save 30% on their cost. 90% of the residents and businesses use furnace oil to heat their homes and hot water. So we had a great opportunity to use the wind farm energy to offset those fossil fuels in the community. The appliances themselves heat ceramic bricks up to a temperature of 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and then they can supply heat throughout the day by being well insulated. They store the energy very well and efficiently.
When we take our software program that keeps track of what our wind farm does in real time, within a minute, we'll know that the wind farm is overproducing or underproducing. And in the same minute, we'll change our load characteristics by making a decision about whether your appliance should be charging or not charging.
The consumer pays for the appliance on the savings of their oil against their savings for the home for heating.
Now, for you, the consumer, you don't need to know when it charges up, because it is charged when you need it. The computer program is simply going to schedule when it fills back up. It's like driving your car and not caring about the gas tank because someone's keeping it full for you.
It's obvious how it protects the environment, how it's a great benefit to our electrical utility and to our citizens.
We had open houses to look at expanding our wind integration.
Well, well, as you could see, is a really interesting project. The clever idea here, of course, is that not only they are making huge savings for the customers that are switching from oil to electricity, but also they are making the most of the wind resource that they have when it's available. One thing to mention here is, of course, that the city of Summerside, they own their own grid, electricity grid, and that has enabled them to be a bit flexible with the approaches that they take. Also, they've introduced, well, within the smart grid scheme, a broadband service is included for the customers that join the scheme. So there are lots of interesting details in this project and lots of things to learn and to take from. Well, if we move to our next project, this is Feldheim in Germany. Feldheim is a small town in Germany. Is somewhere of around 200 people, and it is some 35 kilometers southwest from Berlin, so it's in a very central area of Germany. What is unique about this town is that they have their own electricity and heating networks. So if you think about it, they are energy independent and energy self-sufficient, and they claim to be the only energy independent and the only energy self-sufficient town in Germany. So you might say, okay, there's nothing new really with that, because there are many towns and villages out there in many places in the world that are energy independent and energy self-sufficient. You might think, for example, small island that is not connected to the grid, or a remote community that doesn't have any grid infrastructure nearby. So they are all they have to be energy independent and energy self-sufficient. So what is unique about Feldheim is that, as I say, they are in a central area of Germany, and they don't have any grid constraint whatsoever to connect to the grid, to the German grid. But they've chosen not to be a connected town. So why is that, and how do they manage to do their own grids and balance their own grids? So let's look at the diagram here. So here we have the wind park of Feldheim. So the wind park has around 43 turbines, which in total is somewhere close to 72 megawatts of installed capacity. Of course, all these turbines were not installed for this project, and this didn't happen all at once. The first turbine actually was installed in Feldheim in 1996, and the whole history of this started just when the citizens were like leasing the lands for a private wind developer to build a wind turbine there. But the number of wind turbines were growing and growing as the years came, until the point where they end up with 43 turbines in Feldheim. And at the same point, well, I must say that in the other end of this project is that Feldheim is a town with a farming background. So they have a farmer cooperative there, and in 2006, 2007, the farmers decided that they wanted to build biogas plant, primarily for heating purposes for the farmers and for the three main agricultural enterprises that they have. But when they went ahead with the project, they realized that the biogas plant not only could provide heating to them, but to the rest of the village. And the biogas plant, by default, also produces electricity. So when they had these two things, they said, okay, we have the turbines in-house, we have the biogas plant in-house as well. So why do we need to still import electricity from the grid? So they came up with this idea of building their own grid, their own electricity grid and their own heating grid, and that's how it all started. So here we can see, is the arrow here? Yes. Here we can see the heating networks that they built themselves, well, with some funding from the European Union and funding from the German government as well. And they basically feed the three agricultural enterprises to businesses and the households, around 200 people, as I said. Perhaps in the next slide we see the system more in detail. So they have the wind turbines, they have the biogas, they have the, well, the wind turbines, the biogas plant, and they have a control system as well. It's sort of a smart grid control system where they monitor output from the wind turbines and monitor output from the biogas plant and monitor consumption from the households, the agricultural enterprises, and some business in the area as well. This project is really interesting and really inspirational, because it shows how a small town, how a community can get together and make of the electricity generation of the whole lifestyle. There's a if you're interested to know more about the project, here you have the website of the Feldheim community. And if you go through the website, and if you have a bit of knowledge in German, you can see some videos there, very interesting videos, and that they show how the community itself was transformed from being a farming community to being an energy generating community. The farmers are now not only generating products for local people, they are also generating electricity, and that changed the whole dynamic of the community. So it is a very, very interesting project, very, very inspirational, and that shows more or less the concept that we want to get across in here. If we move to the last one, that links very nicely with the work that we do at Community Energy Scotland. So we believe that innovation is a process that should be done from the bottom up, so at community level. So taking this holistic approach to assess the potential of every project, every community, integrating all the stakeholders that might apply to every project, providing technical support from the beginning until the end of the project. And obviously, when you have a project of this scale, and when you want to have a holistic approach, you have to integrate also government bodies and regulatory bodies, so that you have all the main streams covered. We also, of course, do work with distribution network operators, which are obviously the main core when you're talking about grid. We move to the next one. So, linking with what Felix was saying at the beginning, we will show you the type of projects that we have been involved with. So we've seen what has been done internationally, what other parts of the world are doing. So now we will see what are we doing, and basically, roughly, the solutions that we are championing is like they basically fit in one of those categories that we have here, roughly, more or less. So we have these 4 main categories of solutions that might be implemented. So the first one, active network management. So what is active network management? That refers mainly to situation when we want to control the output of a generator. That situation might come up because we have capacity constraint with the network, or because we have problems balancing the grid, so problems specifically related to power systems and how a network have to be balanced. So in this sense, we want to control the generators. We don't want them to generate freely at nominal output, but we want to tell them when to generate and how much to generate in a specific time. The second solution that we have is demand side management. Demand side management refers to a situation when we want to affect the consumer side rather than the generation side. So in this solution, what we're looking at is modifying the consumer behavior. So when you consume energy, the idea is that we want you to consume energy when we have lots of wind, and we want you to switch off everything when we don't have wind. Well, that's the ideal solution. Another solutions, of course, could be within bringing additional demand when we have surplus energy. So Felix will explain more in detail when we have some projects that are looking at this. The third option is local supply. So local supply basically is a situation when local generator wants to sell their electricity to the local community, and it doesn't want to export the electricity to the main grid. That could basically done in 2 ways. It could be done physically by a private wire, a cable from the generator to the consumer, and that's physically the physical way to do it, or via involving different tariffs to different customers. That's the commercial way to do it. And the fourth solution that we have here is energy storage. And the idea here is basically to add some sort of flexibility to the intermittent sources that we have. So we have wind, we cannot control when the wind is blowing, so we try to transform this energy and store this energy and use it some other time when we actually need it. Energy storage is not only electricity storage, so it's not only batteries, but it can be energy can be stored in any way. So for example, heating or production of hydrogen are one of the best examples for energy storage as well. So having said that, we will now move into the exciting part of the work that we're doing, and for that I will hand over to Felix to tell us more about that. So over to you.
Thanks, Julia.
Okay.
So yeah, what's made the project that we've been working on possible in large part has been thanks to funding from the Scottish Government Cares Fund, which Community Energy Scotland was the delivery body for up until August of this year. It's now delivered by Local Energy Scotland, which is a consortium of Scottish organisations, and it's great that that support is still there. So the Infrastructure Innovation Fund still exists. We're going to be talking about projects that have been supported by it and still looking to access that funding in order to complete and be built. But in the time since it launched in roughly in May 2012, you've got a good spread of projects shown on the map. Relates to about 30 megawatts of capacity, and most of those projects that have got involved have been driven by grid issues. But there's growing interest in innovation as a way of adding value as well. So to talk through these projects, the first one, the first slide is really to reinforce the points that we're making all the way through about looking at the local energy demand context. So rather than just thinking we need a wire to plug our turbine into, it's looking at the range of energy demands in a local area. We did a project in Argyll where a number of communities on islands in the Inner Hebrides were developing projects but couldn't get sufficient grid access for the generation they wanted to develop. And so we wanted to get a better idea of how the generation could feed it into alternative local markets. So we worked with a company called Element Energy to perform an energy audit, and the kind of high-level view of those results is shown on the graph on the right-hand side. What's quite striking straight away is that there's two different scales. It's all gigawatt hours, but the left-hand graph with Isla and Mull shows a massively higher level of total energy demand compared to the other islands. And that, in the case of Mull, that partly reflects population. In the case of Isla, that's reflecting the number of distilleries located on Isla. And if you look at the sort of purpley lilac column, that's showing about 150 gigawatt hours of annual demand for fuel oil, which is used for raising the steam and hot water used in distilling. And if you turn that energy value back into electricity generation from wind turbines, that relates to about 70 megawatts, 60, 70 megawatts of wind turbines. So it's quite interesting that theoretically, if you were to snip off Isla from the mainland, and so ignoring the constraints that there are on the subsea cables and elsewhere on the network, there is sufficient demand to justify significant new generating capacity. How can we make that possible? And this energy audit gives us kind of the evidence base, I suppose, for picking out for each island which sectors have the most potential to create new flexible demand that would enable generation, or would add maximum value to that generation. So on the adding value side, I suppose, the next project in Orkney is looking at a situation where there's a number of operational community-owned turbines in Orkney. The grid there is unique in UK context because the distribution network operator has already implemented an active network management system which is controlling turbine output for those turbines that have connected to the system. That's great. It's enabled these turbines to be connected, otherwise there wouldn't have been enough capacity for them. But the downside, from a generator's point of view, is that there are times when you're turned off, and how much of that varies, but for some of the community turbines, it's a significant amount of time, and it's also more time than they were originally anticipating. So they are very keen to find ways of using the electricity that they're generating, so that they can have the cash flow that they need to service the loans that have been used to finance the projects, and to deliver the benefits to the community. That was the whole point of taking the project forwards. So we did an energy audit type process in Orkney as well, and what that identified was that some specific islands, there wasn't a high level of electricity demand. There was some level of heat demand, but again not huge, and the heat demand was generally domestic and quite far away from where the turbines were. So if you're going to put in infrastructure to feed that, it would be quite an expensive process. The main energy demand was really transport for householders, and also agricultural and marine. So that looked like the obvious sector to focus on, finding a way of feeding the energy value of the electricity into, and could do that through electric vehicles. So that's the next slide. But we also wanted to explore the possibility of using hydrogen primarily as a transport fuel, either as hydrogen or converting it into other fuels such as ammonia or synthetic natural gas. And where we're at this project so far is basically the initial feasibility stage has been completed, and we're now looking at how best to feed the hydrogen into local energy demand. But the generation of the hydrogen itself is perfectly viable, and the value of the hydrogen as a local transport fuel is actually higher than what it would be for exporting to the grid. So that's a really significant shift in terms of how we look at renewable energy generation. The electricity from that turbine is worth more as hydrogen in this context than as electricity going into the grid. So I think that's us seeing the beginning of not just thinking about electric generation as grid-based activity, but fitting into a local energy context. The economics are actually shifting in favour of taking that approach. And like I said, the technology is increasingly proven. Costs are still high, but reducing, and there's definitely scope for more pilot projects that will demonstrate that in practice. The other approach to supplying transport demand is through electric vehicles. The irony is that electric vehicles are quite efficient compared to internal combustion engines, that you don't get the same level of demand as you would do if you're supplying a fuel for internal combustion. That said, the technology is more affordable compared to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, certainly, about parity with converting internal combustion engines to take hydrogen. So we decided to run a pilot using 4 Nissan Leafs on lease for 2 years to basically test the water for the consumer acceptance of electric vehicles. Would they have the range? Were there sufficient charging points? Would they have the right level of comfort and carrying capability for people to actually use them? And then hopefully scale it up so that you're actually creating a much more significant new controllable demand through electric vehicles. These 4 vehicles in themselves aren't going to have much of an impact on the amount of time that turbines are shut down, but it's proof of concept. So part of it is about consumer acceptability. The other side of it is about technical integration, so that the charging times of the vehicles match the times when it's windy, and if there would be insufficient demand on the network, the turbines would be shut off. So we're currently working on the implementation of that side of things, now that the vehicles are there, and the feedback has been really positive from just people using the vehicles. They're available to anyone who wants to use through the trusts that are based on the islands. And I'm pleased to say that partly on the back of this and the interest that's come through this project, there's a really high level of interest in getting more electric vehicles on Orkney. And through a project called My Electric Avenue, something like 10% of the applications for reduced cost leases for electric vehicles are on Orkney. So Orkney, again, is kind of leading the way for innovative renewable energy generation, having already got significant amount of the microgeneration capacity in the UK. I'm hurrying up a little. In terms of drawing together these different aspects of innovative technologies, both on the generation side, on the demand side, on distribution. And really what we think will make that possible is a high level of community engagement, and quid pro quo for community engagement is community benefit. We see community ownership drawing all those things together. And just to give you an update on kind of specifically how we're taking the learning from those projects that we've piloted so far, that generally at the feasibility stage should be moving into capital phase towards the end of this year and next year, is really developing a set of tools for analysing situations like this and making the decision-making process a bit easier. So we'll switch back to Julia to talk that through just briefly.
Yes, okay, thank you, Felix. Yeah, so this is just a quick glance of the kind of work that CES is looking to offer to communities as part of the local energy economy program. So it's basically a step-by-step guidance for communities that either have face grid constraints, or that have a want to have off-grid project, or that just want to maximize the use of renewable energy. And this guidance will ultimately lead the communities to the creation of a local energy economy. What that might look like in the having into account all what we have said so far. So that will be tailored to each community setup. So what opportunities each community have that can be transformed to create this local energy economy. How do we maximize this use of energy locally? And obviously, innovation will be at the heart of this process. A bit of quick look into what is exactly that. So we have a range of starting points and a range of solutions that we want to match according to each community. So if we look at the network, then we could have a community that wants to, well, that is allowed to export until 50 kilowatts limit, which is the limit in the network for exporting before a problem can be spot. Another possible starting point would be a dynamic rating. That's a solution that a network operator would want to implement to better control the parameters of the power system. We have firm and not firm connection. So firm connection, web generator can generate all the time. Not firm connection, you have to disconnect when the power network is not performing within the limits. Or you have reinforcement, which is basically the most costly options and the less likely to happen. In the side of the demand, then we have two big categories: storage and demand side response. If we see into each of these categories, then we can either go to demand side response, controlling heating, cooling, or pumping options, or we can go through storage, and there is a big range of solutions that you can find within the storage category. So how do we fit which solutions to the starting points? So that's the main advantages. That's the main progress that we are offering in this local energy program. So obviously each option wouldn't fit to every possible community, but you have to assess what are the best options for the project. So that was a bit quick, but if you are really interested in this, and well, as you can see, this is an area with a growing interest, and it has like a really exciting work, not only in Scotland, but all, as you could see, internationally. So if you really want to know more, join us for a couple of exciting days this November. It's our conference, so Felix will explain more about that, but it would be great if you could join us. Felix?
Yeah, so a bit of a plug for our conference. It's over 2 days, and it's in Glasgow, the Borough Halls, and there's a link to the booking. The first day, I've just uploaded a little bit of the program, and it's very much focused on local energy economies, and be introducing the concept, but then having talks from some of the people that Julia's mentioned already, Greg Gorday from Summerside, and Wenna Frowitter from Feldheim, and Lars Jacobsen from Lolland in Denmark, where they've got a very well integrated hydrogen system. So really people who've done it, who know how it works in their context, and can talk about what the benefits have been for local people. So myself and Julia were speaking to Greg yesterday, and he was asking what electricity prices are like in the UK, and I was saying about 15-14 pence per unit ish, and he was saying, "All right, well, we're paying about half of that, and for heat, and about 40% off that as well. So they're down at something like 4 or 5 pence per kilowatt hour for their heating. They'll have hopefully the answers to sort of some of your questions that we might not be able to cover today, and then a really wide range of speakers looking at different demand sectors and how demand can be used to enable generation the way we've been talking about, including Maitland Mackey from Mackey's Ice Cream, where they've got turbines that feed straight into their ice cream factory. We've got Darren Mawhinney from Dimplex, who have developed a new sort of storage heater, which is much more efficient and controllable. And Rachel Sharp from Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group, talking about the hydrogen bus project. There's another set of breakout sessions looking at how you implement technologies. So you've identified the demand and how it can be controlled. How do you put that into practice operationally in terms of commercial arrangements, metering, billing, etc. So split that into behind the meter solutions and then grid-based solutions, looking at local electricity supply arrangements. We're really excited to have Robert Tudway from the Greater London Authority, who are the first organisation in the UK to be applying for a new sort of electricity supply licence from the regulator, Ofgem, which, if successful, could be really transformational for the community and local energy sector, because it will basically make it more possible for smaller supply companies to be set up. So I think that's a really, really exciting talk. And we'll also be hearing from Branka, from Mainstreaming Innovation, as well as some other academic organisations who are really working in this sector to say how learning can be shared and the benefits of taking this approach can be measured. So it'd be great to see you there. And that is now the end of the presentation, and we're open to any questions that you guys may have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Felix and Julia. It was really interesting, a lot of good information that will help everyone understand how these systems can be developed, established, and new concepts of renewable energy generation in communities. For the moment, we do not have any questions, we'll see, but I have prepared a few questions. Well, you have mentioned that you are developing a set of tools and guidance. Will they be available online?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're hoping that they will. It's mainly work for CES.
Yes.
So the tool as a software thing or downloading,
yes,
thing to download won't be available to everyone. But then we will be using this set of tools to advise communities and to advise projects. So the knowledge of this tool will be available for communities and projects.
Okay. Yes. Maybe just one question that, well, there is a question coming from Neil Phillips, let's see, of Positive Solutions. What was the capital cost of the hydrogen project?
Okay, so the hydrogen project isn't built yet. It's just gone through feasibility, and like I said, we're looking at the best way of using the hydrogen that would be produced. So we've sized the electrolyzer, sized the storage system, and then looking at whether we supply that directly as a transport fuel or whether we convert it in some other forms. But in broad terms, having the electrolyzer and fuel dispensing and storage for a sort of 250 kilowatt electrolyzer would be about £1 million.
Okay.
So it's not cheap. But if you've got a turbine in a windy site and you're having to shut down a lot, roughly if you're being shut down more than 40-50% of the time when you would otherwise be generating, then it is financially viable to do that. What is more challenging financially is the cost of the hydrogen infrastructure in terms of end use. So we've calculated that roughly to create the demand for that hydrogen would cost another £1.5 million. And that's something that is falling on the hydrogen provider, because at the moment we don't have that infrastructure. It'd be a bit like building an electricity generator and having to build the grid from scratch, or the road system from scratch if you're looking at transport. So that's the main challenge financially. The tipping point for producing hydrogen, I think we're nearly there, certainly in windy places with high local transport costs. But the cost of providing the infrastructure to use that hydrogen is still quite challenging.
Okay. Another question from Neil again. What percentage capital costs came from EU and what percentage came from German government in Feldheim?
Yes, I don't have the percentage up now, but I'm sure if you check the online website that I showed in the slide, they do say, but yes, I don't really recall what was the percentage.
Okay. A question from Keith Pierce. What would you estimate the smallest size system might be given current technologies?
The smallest size system in terms of generation? Does it say?
He continues, I see Feldheim has 47 households, so probably he's looking into balance between number of households and what is available technologies and what is then cost-effective, most cost-effective.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've got one project which has only got 3 households, which is an outdoor centre in Ardnamurchan on the west coast, where they've got a small hydro scheme feeding into a private wire network, which is also grid connected, but is supplying electricity to those households. And the innovation bit that we're working on is actually sending some electricity into heat to replace the LPG and oil that they're using. So it's quite technology specific what scale is viable. In this instance, the approach we're taking is viable because the cost of putting in the heat storage systems isn't that much. If you're looking to put in hydrogen infrastructure, you'd probably want a larger scale project for that to be viable. Likewise, electric vehicles can be plugged in quite easily. The cost of charging points isn't that great. So I guess this is what we're emphasizing, is that it's always going to be quite site specific in terms of going through an energy audit process and looking at the best fit for the available generation and the value of that energy locally.
Okay, a question from Jerry Kelly. What are the significant stumbling blocks for microgrids?
The cost. So compared to connecting to existing infrastructure, where you're not having to pay for that existing infrastructure, i.e. there isn't a big reinforcement associated with that connection, then that is the most affordable way of having an operational generator, because the grid's already there. So as soon as you start building your own bits of network, whether that's private wire or microgrid, you're adding cost. So you only do that really where you have to, or where the value that you're adding by being control over that supply chain justifies that investment. So ballpark figures, we're working on a project in Applecross where they've got a 100 kilowatt hydro generator. We're looking to put in a private wire network to enable them to increase their output to about 200 kilowatts. The cost of putting in that network is looking at around £150,000 to connect about 30 households. So it's borderline. And it's quite sensitive to the price of the heating fuel that they'll be substituting. In their instance, there's a lot of people on heating oil, and the costs for that are quite high. So it makes sense to put in the microgrid. If you transpose that project to an urban context where people are on gas, you probably wouldn't bother doing it.
Okay. We don't have any questions right now online. And I'm aware of the time, but I think we still have some time for questions. So would you say then, you mentioned that you also feed back into policies. Would you say that subsidies from Scottish government or governments in principle would be necessary really for these types of projects, because it's not only about specific communities benefiting from them, but the society in general, security of energy supply in different countries, industry, and so on. So it shouldn't be just a narrow view on, well, the community benefits, they should pay for the grid connection and so on.
Yeah.
Isn't that the case, that the governments should support these communities and give some subsidies for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two messages. One is funding for some of the infrastructure that is required to enable this sort of approach. So, in the case of hydrogen, that infrastructure isn't there. Previously, the cost of grid, the cost of gas networks were socialized. So we think if you want to have a level playing field and you're introducing a new technology, yes, some of the costs of putting that in should be socialized. But the flip side as well is that the arrangements for market access need to be changed to create a more level playing field, which would reduce the amount of subsidy required. So, for example, I mean, in terms of the electricity market, people are selling the electricity to a supplier for about 5 pence per unit. That electricity then being retailed at about 16, 15 pence per unit. If you were able to have more locally owned supply companies, the chances are, we've done some modelling, they could add value to the generation by between 50 and 100%. So that means they'd be less sensitive or need less subsidy to be financially viable. So it's not always, I think, about going out and asking for more money from the government. It's about making sure that the rules are fair for all scales of generator. But certainly in terms of new infrastructure, yes, funding was required for that. We've been doing some work with the Scottish Government looking at EU funding, the next round from 2014 to 2020, and it looks likely there's going to be quite a big emphasis on green infrastructure, which really welcome and think is necessary.
Well, thank you very much, both to you, Felix and Julia. That was very informative, and now we are close to the end of our webinar. Well, I would like to attract attention of our online viewers to 3 forthcoming events. First of all, on 29th of October, we have a live event about Horizon 2020, European funding. And it is about understanding the opportunities for Scotland, especially in construction. That event will take place here at Glasgow Caledonian University, but it will also be a webinar, and we will provide a video recording of the event after it has happened. On 30th of October, we will have a webinar on research and practice in sustainable infrastructure delivered by Dr. Kate Hill of School of Geosciences and David Somerville, Sustainability Advisor at the University of Edinburgh, talking about their research at this university and also practice in achieving more sustainable infrastructure at the university campus. And finally, on 7th of November, we have a whole day event here at Glasgow at the Lighthouse about localized energy generation and distribution, funding, research and practice, where we will have speakers from Technology Strategy Board, from CARES and for Communities Energy Scotland again, and of course some researchers from the universities involved in our project. I hope that you will book places on our website for these events or watch some of these video recordings or webinars. And I look forward to speaking to you again at future webinars. Thank you for watching.